Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at Revival Waves of Glory Ministries, and in particular, the life and ministry of Bill Vincent. Now, you sent us some excerpts from a book called From Trials to Triumph, written by Jim Stevens, and it really chronicles Bill Vincent's journey in a really compelling way. So we're going to kind of unpack that together, focusing on, the key insights from his life, his belief system, and really the lasting impact of his work. You ready to jump in?
I am, yeah. When you first open this book and you read the foreword, it's actually written by Bill Vincent himself. And right away, he sets the stage by emphasizing themes of faith and the importance of perseverance and, that strong sense of God's presence in every aspect of life. And he really highlights Jim Stevens' ability, the author, to weave together these stories of, trials and triumphs and what are described as like these really powerful divine encounters that he's had. And I think one of the things that Vincent really wants readers to take away is that sense of encouragement, to really see how God can work in difficult circumstances and use those to shape a life of purpose, right?
I think that's a really important point. And then, Jim Stevens, in the section where he talks about why he wrote the book, he kind of adds this whole other personal dimension to it. He shares that his connection to Bill Vincent actually began with like a prophetic word, and that really had a deep impact on his own life and his own direction. And he speaks of Vincent not simply as a mentor, which is obviously a huge role, but as like a living example of faith in action, just really this embodiment of the miraculous, of the power of faith. And it's clear that Stevens wants to honor Vincent's influence in his life. He wants to share this incredible story of, redemption and resilience and just that deep, deep commitment that defines Vincent's life and work.
It really adds a lot of weight, right? Like, it's one thing to have a biographer come in and look at facts and figures and, and tell a story in that sense. But when it comes from somebody who's been personally impacted, there's a whole other dimension there, right? So it's really setting the stage for us to enter into this journey through like a trusted friend, and I'm really interested to see where this takes us.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really fascinating to unpack all of that. So let's start. Chapter 1, it's called Early Life and Background. We go all the way back to Bill Vincent's childhood, his upbringing, starting in Greenville, Illinois in 1973. And the book really paints this picture of like a close-knit community. But we also learn that for Bill, Greenville held both like the warmth of that community, but also these really significant experiences of hardship. And I think those two are always going to be like intertwined, especially in these stories. We hear about how important the church was in his life from a young age. And, we're introduced to some key figures like his Aunt Virginia, who really provided a stable and supportive home when he was going through some particularly difficult times, and his brother Alan, who is described as like a source of protection for him. And it's interesting, the chapter also talks about him having a spiritual awakening when he was just 17 years old, and it was marked by him actually hearing God's voice and even experiencing visions, which is, that's pretty profound stuff, right?
But what the book really emphasizes as foundational are these two really pivotal experiences. One is this divine encounter, and it follows an experience of abuse that he went through. And then the other thing that's highlighted is it describes it as like a complex relationship with his mother. And it really frames those experiences, both, the challenging and then this divine encounter, as really shaping the very core of his faith and ultimately his calling to ministry.
Yeah, it's so interesting how often you hear that, right? That people who end up going into really meaningful ministry often have these really intense experiences in their early life, right? These crucibles, as some people call them, where, they experience both a really beautiful sense of community, but then also profound like trauma or difficulty. And it kind of creates this lens, I guess, through which they view both human vulnerability and the potential for, divine interaction. And I think the fact that his early experiences, even those visions and hearing God's voice as a teenager, are highlighted in this way. It kind of suggests that his spiritual path was, in a sense, like marked or set apart from quite a young age.
Right. It's interesting, right? Because sometimes it's like you have a choice, right? Some people might go through these really challenging experiences and kind of close down or pull away, but it seems like he was really pulled toward something. And I think that's what sets apart a lot of people who do this work. So we move on to Chapter 2, Education and Spiritual Growth. This is where we start to see Bill Vincent kind of formally preparing for ministry. He attended Latter Rain Ministries Bible School, and then he later went on to study at Christian International. And at Christian International, he not only studied, but he also taught, which I think is really interesting. And the book really makes it clear that mentorship was absolutely crucial during this period of his life. It specifically mentions Dr. Dennis Goodell, Rowan and Mary Carteret, and even Bob Jones as people who, really invested in his development and in his understanding of, of faith and ministry.
And we also learn about some key spiritual experiences during this time, including this really significant revival that happened in 1998. And then the book also talks about how he returned to church after a period of, it's described as backsliding, which I think is really interesting to include because it just shows that, faith is not always this linear, perfect path. It's messy. There are ups and downs. And it's really about, that commitment to coming back, to re-engaging. And these events are presented as really shaping his approach to ministry and even influencing his later writing.
That's a really interesting dynamic, the formal education versus the guidance of mentors, right? Because it's he's getting that framework, that theological, that biblical framework from these institutions. But then you have these mentors who are walking alongside him, right? And they're giving him that practical wisdom and just kind of, the guidance from their own experiences. And it's that weaving together that I think is so powerful. And yeah, I think that revival in 98 really stands out, because it was clearly a moment where he reconnected in a really powerful way. And you're right. I appreciate the honesty about, going through that period of stepping away and then coming back, because I think that makes him so much more relatable. It shows us that even people who end up in these really, influential positions in ministry, they're human. They have those moments of doubt, those moments of questioning. And ultimately it's about that journey back, right? How do we navigate those ups and downs?
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful thing. It makes the whole story that much more authentic. Yeah. So then we move on to chapter 3, Journey into Ministry. And here we go deeper into this really significant mentorship relationship with Dr. Dennis Goodell. And I think the book makes this really interesting point. It says that, his learning from Dr. Goodell was more about being, and I'm quoting here, caught rather than taught, which I think is such a powerful way to put it. It emphasizes the importance of that hands-on, immersive kind of mentorship. And we hear about how he got started, in really practical ways. He served as an usher, which is such a humble beginning, right? And then there's this moment where he's asked to pray over prayer requests, which I think is a really significant step, being entrusted with that level of responsibility with people's, deepest needs and desires. And then the chapter also talks about, how he dealt with the challenges of his past and of being a young man in ministry, because, that can come with its own baggage and skepticism, right?
And ultimately, this all leads to him developing this very clear mission, this clear vision for what he wanted to do, which was really centered around igniting revival and equipping believers. It's about empowering other people to kind of step into their own faith. And the book also highlights his early efforts, his early ministry endeavors, the personal challenges he faced, and this really rounded approach to ministry that includes both, aspects of healing and also that spiritual restoration.
Yeah, the idea of being caught versus taught. I mean, I think that resonates so deeply because it speaks to the fact that ministry is not just about head knowledge, right? It's about this lived experience. It's about being in those situations, observing, participating, really getting your hands dirty, so to speak. And for him to have that experience of praying over prayer requests, that must have been so powerful, right? Because it's that moment where you step into those shoes and you realize, okay, I'm being called to do this, to be a vessel. And yeah, the fact that he had to overcome both, the weight of his past and the perceptions that might come with his age, I think that speaks volumes about his determination and his conviction, right? He was clearly called to do this.
And it's amazing, right? Because the challenges could have easily been a deterrent, but for him, it seems like they kind of fueled his passion even more. So chapter 4, becoming an author. And this is where we start to explore the inspiration behind Bill Vincent's really extensive writing career. And it really started to take off, it seems, while he was teaching at Victory Lighthouse Ministry. So again, we see that connection between teaching, being in ministry, and then that spilling over into writing and creating resources. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting to note that he actually had prior experience in the publishing industry. So he kind of came into this with a lot of knowledge, a lot of, understanding of how the publishing world works. And he ultimately went on to establish RWG Publishing, so his own publishing house. And the chapter really delves into the core themes that run through his books, which is amazing because he's written over 200 books. And these central themes are, really focusing on the tangible presence of God and the reality of spiritual warfare.
And, specific titles are mentioned, books like Increasing Your Prophetic Gift and Destroying the Jezebel Spirit.
Those are just two examples, but it really examines how he balances that writing with his active ministry, which is, that's a lot to juggle. And it also talks about the impact his writing has had and ultimately his vision for the future of his work as an author. What do you think about that? I mean, 200 books is incredible.
It is. I mean, that's a life's work right there. It really speaks to that prolific, outpouring of thought and teaching. And it's interesting how it kind of naturally evolved, right? He's teaching, he realizes there's a need for resources, for materials, and then he's got that background in publishing. It all comes together. And I think the fact that those two themes, God's presence and spiritual warfare, are highlighted, it really gives us a sense of like the core tenets of his ministry, right? Like what is he really trying to get across through his work? And it's a pretty clear message, I think.
It really is. And I think, for our listeners, we'll put a link in the show notes to Revival Waves of Glory Ministries website so you can actually check out all of his books. And we move on to chapter 5, and buckle up, because this is where we get into a life of miracles and faith. And this chapter recounts some pretty extraordinary events from Bill Vincent's life. It starts with stories of healings that he experienced when he was a kid, like, boils being healed, and even a significant knee injury that was completely resolved. And it's interesting, his own journey into ministry, it was really solidified, it says, by witnessing miracles that were happening under Dr. Dedeskidel's ministry. So again, we see that mentorship having a really profound impact. The chapter also shares his personal experiences with divine healing, including, another issue with that knee that had been injured when he was younger, a correction of an uneven leg length, and even the healing of an enlarged heart condition.
And then there's this really intense period that's described as a 2-year boot camp of injuries and surgeries, which ultimately leads to a really significant breakthrough healing during a revival meeting. And throughout this chapter, the book really emphasizes the global impact of his healing ministry and the power of personal testimony.
Wow. Yeah, it's hard to hear those stories and not be impacted in some way, right? I mean, regardless of your personal beliefs, these accounts of miraculous events are definitely a core part of his story and the beliefs of this ministry. And the sheer volume of, reported healings, both the ones he experienced personally and the ones he witnessed, I mean, that really speaks to how central this is to his life and to his work. And that 2-year boot camp, culminating in that breakthrough healing during revival, I mean, that sounds like the kind of experience that would profoundly change your understanding of faith and healing.
Absolutely. And I think that's the point, right? It's about sharing these stories and allowing people to, to come to their own conclusions, but also to see the power of, of belief, of faith, and what can happen when people really, really believe. So chapter 6, we're going to shift gears a little bit. It's called Challenges and Triumphs. This is where we get to see a bit more of the human side of things. It talks about some of the difficulties that Bill Vincent faced throughout his life, both personally and in ministry. And it talks about, early on facing skepticism because he was so young when he started out in ministry. People maybe didn't take him seriously because of his age. And then he goes on to talk about personal struggles within his first marriage. And the book specifically mentions, this concept of the Jezebel spirit and the periods of despair that he went through and how he ultimately overcame them through faith and worship. And then the Litchfield revival is really highlighted as this pivotal moment of fulfillment. It's a turning point in his journey.
And the chapter also talks about how he learned to navigate doubts, because those are going to come up for anybody, especially someone in a position like his. And it talks about, his process of surrendering to God's leading, even when maybe it wasn't exactly what he expected or what he initially wanted, especially in terms of the intensity and the direction of his prophetic ministry.
It's really refreshing to see that honesty, about the challenges. Because I think sometimes with people who are, leaders or in ministry, we kind of put them on a pedestal and we forget that they're human, right? They have the same struggles, the same doubts, the same pain. And I think this chapter really brings that to light. And it's important. And, I think the early skepticism because of his youth, I mean, a lot of people can relate to that no matter what field you're in, people underestimate you because of your age. But then the personal struggles in his marriage, that just adds another layer, right? It shows us the complexity of his story, the fact that he's not perfect. Nobody is. And then, Litchfield Revival being that moment of fulfillment, it kind of shows that despite everything, he was making a difference. And then that point about navigating doubts and surrendering to God's leading, that's huge. I mean, that's a lifelong process for anybody who's on a spiritual path, right? It's about learning to let go of control and really trust in something bigger than yourself.
Yeah. And I think it's really about finding that balance, right? Because you have your own desires, your own ambitions, but then there's this deeper sense of calling. And sometimes those two things aren't always aligned. So it's about navigating that tension. So we've gone to chapter 7, Impact and Legacy. And here the book shares a lot of different testimonies of healing and deliverance that people have experienced through Bill Vincent's ministry. And it specifically mentions the impact of his book, Defeating the Demonic Realm. It's really interesting because the chapter highlights that his main focus,
His way of measuring success is not about, numbers or statistics, but about transformed lives. It's about seeing that real change in people, which I think is really beautiful. And the chapter talks about the reach of his books, books like Increasing Your Prophetic Gift, how those have impacted people all over the world. And it really emphasizes his commitment to integrity, to faithfulness, even when he's faced controversy. Because anybody who's out there doing this work is going to come up against those who disagree, who criticize.
But it seems like he's always remained very committed to his core values and to ultimately pointing people to Jesus. And that's his legacy, right? It's about leading people to a deeper relationship with God. And then talks about his efforts to preserve his teachings and to mentor future leaders so that this work can continue.
Yeah, I really appreciate that emphasis on transformed lives as the measure of success, because I think so often, especially in ministry, we can get caught up in, how many people are in the seats, how much money is being raised, those external metrics. But ultimately, it's about people's hearts, right? It's about their lives being changed. And that commitment to integrity amidst controversy, I think that's so important, because it's easy to kind of, get swayed or to compromise when you're facing pressure. But he seems to have stayed true to his convictions. And yeah, that desire to leave a legacy that points people to Jesus, I think that's the heart of it, right? It's not about building an empire for himself. It's about serving something greater.
Yeah. And I think that's what sets apart people who are in it for the right reasons. It's about that selfless service. So chapter 8, personal reflections. This chapter really gives us a peek behind the curtain. It's a glimpse into Bill Vincent's own spiritual practices, his personal disciplines. And we learned about his daily commitment to prayer and his reliance on God's guidance. It's not just something he talks about. It's something he lives out every day. And the chapter mentions these really influential teachings that he received from someone he calls Brother Denny. And he talks about how, scriptures have guided him, especially 1 John 4.4. And it's interesting. He talks about how his perspective on ministry has evolved over time. In the beginning, there's that tendency to, want approval, want validation, but he's really shifted towards prioritizing that personal intimacy with God over any kind of, outward success or recognition. And he talks about his appreciation for ministry in all forms, whether it's in a huge setting or in a one-on-one conversation, it's all valuable. And the chapter really highlights these core values of integrity, compassion, and then also his daily practices of gratitude and generosity.
I love that. It's like he's showing us the inner workings, It's not just about what he does publicly, but about those daily choices, those daily practices that really shape his life and his ministry. And that emphasis on prayer, on seeking God's guidance, that's the foundation, right? It's about staying connected, staying aligned. And I think that shift from seeking external validation to prioritizing that inner connection, that's huge. It's like he's realizing that true fulfillment comes from that relationship with the divine, not from, applause or recognition.
I think it's a lesson we can all learn, right? No matter what we do in life, it's about finding that center, that inner compass. So, chapter 9, day-to-day life. And here we get a look at Bill Vincent's daily routine. And it is structured. This guy's disciplined. The chapter talks about how he balances his spiritual devotion with writing and with overseeing RWG publishing. And he has this whole system. He releases daily prophetic nugget videos. He does weekly downloads from heaven, sermons, and then he has bi-monthly prophetic downloads. So he's constantly creating content, constantly sharing his insights. And it talks about the balance between work and personal life and really, the inspiration behind all of this. It's about prayer. It's about worship. It's about that constant connection.
It's like a well-oiled machine, right? And that's not to say that it's like robotic or anything, but there's a clear intentionality, He's got that discipline, he's got that structure, and it allows him to be really productive and consistent. And the fact that he's doing those daily nuggets, the weekly sermons, the bi-monthly downloads, it's like he's creating these different entry points for people, right? Whether you have 5 minutes or an hour, there's something there for you.
And I think that's so important in today's world. People are busy, so you have to meet them where they are. And now we come to chapter 10, advice and insights. And in this chapter, B. Vincent is really sharing wisdom from his years of experience. He offers guidance for aspiring ministers, for writers, for anybody who's on a path of service. And he really emphasizes, first and foremost, having a true calling. Making sure that this is something that you are meant to do, that it comes from deep within you. And then he talks about having that close relationship with God, striving for personal holiness, and the absolute necessity of perseverance. This work is not easy. You're going to face challenges, you're going to face setbacks, but it's about pushing through those, but not giving up. And then he has specific advice for new authors, which I thought was interesting. He really encourages them to just write, to get the words down, to not be afraid of imperfection, and to consider self-publishing as an option. And then he also shares strategies for maintaining faith, for staying focused, especially during those difficult times which we all go through. And he shares some key lessons that he's learned along the way, like being transparent, setting healthy boundaries, and just really prioritizing your own well-being.
I love how practical it is, you know? It's not just these vague platitudes, but real actionable advice. And that emphasis on having a true calling, I mean, that's so foundational, right? Because if you're not doing what you're meant to do, it's going to be a struggle. And I think his advice for writers is so encouraging, you know, just to write, to not be afraid of making mistakes, because that's how we learn. And yeah, I think those lessons about transparency and boundaries are huge, because especially in ministry, can be easy to pour yourself out until there's nothing left, but you have to take care of yourself.
It's so true. So we come to chapter 11, and this one's called Future Goals. And here we get a glimpse of what Bill Vincent is working on, what he's envisioning for the future. And it mentions a book specifically about the Litchfield Revival, which was clearly a pivotal moment for him. And then he's also working on transcribing hundreds of sermons into book format. So he's got this huge archive, and he's making it accessible to people. And the chapter mentions plans for expanded editions of some of his most popular books, and also, you know, those ongoing daily and weekly ministry commitments. He's not slowing down. And it talks about his vision for getting back into traveling and doing more in-person ministry, reaching new audiences. He's even thinking about writing books about historical figures and possibly even children's literature. So he's really branching out, and it all comes back to, you know, that core vision of equipping the body of Christ.
Wow. He's got a lot going on. It's pretty impressive. It's clear that he has a really forward-thinking vision for his ministry. And that book about the Litchfield Revival, I'm sure that will be a powerful resource. I mean, clearly that was a significant event. And to have it documented, you know, with historical context, I think that will be really valuable. And transcribing all those sermons, I mean, that's a labor of love, but it makes sense because it's a way of preserving his teachings, making them available to a wider audience. And I love that he's thinking about branching out, you know, writing about historical figures, even children's books. It just shows that he's always looking for new ways to connect, to share his message.
Exactly. And I think that's what keeps things fresh and exciting. And we finally arrive at the conclusion of the book, and it's titled Conclusion: A Life of Faith, Miracles, and Purpose. And it's a really powerful summary of Bill Vincent's journey. It brings together all those themes we've been talking about, you know, the power of redemption, that unwavering faith, the significance of miracles both in his life and in his ministry, and that really strong sense of purpose. And it reinforces this message that even difficult beginnings, even painful experiences can be transformed into a life of meaning, a life of impact. And it ends with this emphasis on compassion, on authenticity, and on that call for unity, which I think are really powerful messages to leave us with.
It's a beautiful way to wrap things up, and it really drives home the message of the book. And, you know, the idea that even out of those broken places, those difficult experiences, something beautiful can emerge. That's a message of hope, right? And that's ultimately what he seems to be all about.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway. So for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about Bill Vincent's teachings and exploring what the book describes as, you know, the grace of God in action, please visit revivalwavesofgloryministries.com. There's a ton of information there, resources. You can really dive in and explore at your own pace.
I think it's clear from everything we've talked about today that this book, From Trials to Triumph, really presents Bill Vincent's life and ministry as deeply intertwined with his faith and with these experiences that he describes as miraculous. And it offers a really personal, really detailed look into his life journey, into how his ministry developed, and really into the core beliefs that underpin everything he does.
We've gone pretty deep into these excerpts today, and I hope this conversation has given you a better understanding of Bill Vincent's story, you know, the things he believes in and the work that he does. And it's a story that's full of both, you know, profound challenges and really extraordinary expressions of faith. And I think there's a lot to learn from that, a lot to think about.
I think we've just scratched the surface, honestly. I mean, you sent us some excerpts, but it's a whole book, right? And there's so much more there to unpack. And if anything that we talked about today really resonated with you, I would definitely encourage you to check out the full book. It's definitely worth a read. And, you know, I think those themes that we talked about, the perseverance, the role of mentorship, and just, you know, the transformative power of faith in the face of adversity, I think those are things that are really worth reflecting on.
And if you'd like to experience more from this ministry, you can always visit revivalwavesofgloryministries.com. They have all sorts of resources available, So I just want to say thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Revival Waves of Glory Ministries and, of course, the inspiring life of Bill Vincent. We hope this has been insightful. Thank you for listening to the Deep Dive Podcast.